right, we are back. Last week we said we were going to talk about force plates, and we actually are going to talk about force plates. So we didn't lie to you, as we sometimes do, about what topic we're going to talk about. So obviously we've been doing some work with the University of Nebraska Omaha. I think that there's some other possibility for some more force plate work. We have some from Australia as well, our partnership with them, where we've been collecting pitcher force plate data. And so we've been starting to unpack that a little bit. I know that has been fun for you guys to sort of see. We think that there's going to be a lot of power in that data as we continue to look at it and understand it. But maybe if you just want to kick off kind of however you want to kind of kick this off, like what we've been seeing, where the force plates are, maybe what sort of we're gathering from that information, and just some of the things that you're seeing from that process.
Yeah, this has been a topic probably since pitch doc that I've been kind of obsessed with, and I'll connect that back to pitch doc in a second. But this idea of the rule change, particularly with the stride foot, is where a lot of this force plate information has really brought to light some things that it's one of those, like, once you see it, you can't unsee it. And so about a year ago, it was been last August of 2024, through our work with Nebraska Omaha in the pitching lab, one of their grad students, Taka, presented at the American Society of Biomechanics. And it was the first opportunity we had to really put some research, kind of out there on the information that we've been gathering through motion capture and force plates. And that project was really about understanding impulse, the way that force is created over time, and also the direction, particularly of the drive foot. So whether that, that impulse, which is again, a component of force, is created more towards the catcher or more vertically. And what we really kind of discovered through that was a very low sample size. I think we had 11 pitchers at the time. It was a really low sample size. And what we really, kind of came to light was that there is a trade-off. There's a ratio of this, like how much force and in what time, how quickly essentially do you put that in the forward direction towards the catcher versus vertical, that there is a ratio. We need a much, much bigger sample size, obviously, to tell us, and guide more specifically what a range of that ratio should look like. But when essentially we have this, I won't say a balance, it's not quite 50-50, but when we have this ratio of vertical force to anterior force, it correlates very strongly to ball velocity, at least in that small sample. So that's kind of where we started, and really trying to understand what the influence of the force plates could be in our understanding of the pitching motion. And then, we fast forwarded, obviously, more than a year. We have our relationship with UNO, which is still incredibly strong. And we have the opportunity now to have still full motion capture, additional pitchers on force plates. And then our agreement with Diamond Advantage and working with some of the Softball Australia athletes also afforded us more opportunity to bring in motion capture and force plates. So we've had this influx now of much larger sample size. And so as I was preparing for pitch talk, one of my kind of components of pitch talk was talking about the rule change. So, I gave a little background of, we've been having this sort of battle of moving the pitching distance back and where that scales in the game. And that the 2018 rule change of being able to start now with the stride foot behind the pitching rubber was a pretty major shift in the constraint of pitching. If I joke about the, uphill both ways in the snow, that was not how I learned to pitch. It's not how Ashley, you learned to pitch as your
Right.
career as a pitcher. It's not how any of us learned to pitch. We had to keep our feet connected to the rubber, for the entirety of load, essentially. And so opening up that stride foot, moving that stride foot away from the catcher, it afforded some things for sure. And I think the original intent, if I kind of understand the I'll say anecdotal history that I've gathered from coaches, is that it was meant to increase velocity, right? So we moved the pitching rubber back to help with safety, and bats getting hotter and hitters hitting harder. And what we then said was, okay, shoot, we've lost velocity because now the pitcher's 3 feet back and the ball's breaking differently. And even some of the scalability between, like, going from 35 to 40 to 43, where that shows up is even still kind of a mess. But that change in 2018 was a big one. It was a pretty big influence on how we then began to train pitching, the compensations that showed up. And so in that pitch doc presentation, I kind of drew the line essentially of, okay, here's 2018, we go to 2019, now we see some of the travel organizations start to adopt this. And then there is that huge red line in spring of 2020 when the NCAA actually first adopted the rule, because we all know what happened in March 2020, right? The world shut down, sports were, off the table. And so we lost this opportunity to see how this rule change played out kind of in the immediacy of its application in the NCAA, right? The 2020 season's cut very short. There wasn't opportunity to, or a carrot to continue to train. And so we just also let, young pitchers go right back into the youth world and the travel ball world in the summer after that shutdown with, maybe minimal understanding of a ramp up. And so there's lots of things that kind of got lost in the context of what was going on in the world at that time. And so we've had now, it's been 5 years, right, that we've seen this shift. We've seen some changes with, the way the stride foot gets utilized. We see some pitchers, for example, like Carlin Pickens, who, because of her height and the way she's built, that stride foot is like on second base for her, and she can get away with that. But I think that we've lost this component of like, what does the, a pitcher who is of average height, of average build, what does she need? And so where the force plates come in is that now that we have the advantage of seeing the forces that get created, the direction, the magnitude. Again, impulse is a factor of how quickly that's getting applied. What I have been seeing consistently since we really began to integrate the force plates into our debriefs, probably the last 5 months or so, is that, pre this conversation and really pre having the force plates, I would have said, oh shoot, you come out of your drive foot because your posture's poor, right? You can't stay, tilted anteriorly. You're not in this like really good loaded position. You're not on your drive foot in a way that loads your glutes. And so we would have said, okay, it's related to your posture. And what I kept seeing out of this force plate information was that actually, no, we got to go back to the stride foot's contribution. And the most common pattern I see right now is the stride foot is doing way too much. And it makes sense. We've moved it back. So it's got a longer distance to travel now in terms of getting, momentum, generating momentum. It can generate momentum because it's going to have more time, right? It's got more space to be able to then get out to where they would land in terms of their stride foot load. And so now I see, and again, it's a pattern I can't unsee, is the stride foot's doing too much. From a health and injury standpoint, I think we're seeing a connection as well to the stride foot essentially not allowing pitchers to really rotate from the right place. It's become this very limb dominant, driven movement. And so what I see in the pattern is, okay, the stride foot has just got its force plate information, its magnitude of forces. It's higher than the drive foot. So there's a ton of propulsion, right? We are just pushing and driving off that stride foot. And what that essentially kind of generates is, especially if it's not directed towards the catcher, is this like whiplash effect. So the stride foot loads, and oftentimes when a pitcher doesn't have great trunk control, or, maybe they have the habit of kind of, I call it like a toe dump or a knee dump, they cheat the rotation. It creates this whiplash effect where like the trunk and the upper body, they're like, oh shoot, that was a lot of propulsion. And so they end up then kind of being whiplashed away from the catcher. And that's actually the change in posture. It's not that, you just don't load your drive leg well. It's that, no, literally your stride foot is creating way too much for your trunk to handle from a stability standpoint. And you're getting pulled out of posture because of that. And then now what we can see is essentially the consequence of that, of the impact it has on the loading of the drive foot and where rotation should be driven from. Our limbs are going to help us rotate no matter what, but if we can concentrate that on the correct side of the body, then we can kind of get to the root of like these late trunk arm timing issues, rotation being either too much or too little. We have more control when the stride foot is not just like slamming in the ground and just giving all the momentum forward. And it's a very, very common pattern. I mean, I would say probably in the last, I probably debriefed 20 plus pitchers in the last 5 months with this information. It's a pretty common pattern. If someone really has this, like, they're going to put energy and they're going to use their legs, it's coming from the stride foot, and it wreaks havoc down the chain. And I think like this is going to be, I think, an important concept for us when we talk about how we set pitchers up on the rubber moving forward, and the contribution and discussion of like, where should that stride foot be behind the pitching rubber. We never really talked about that. We just let kids kind of decide, and as most things in softball, we tend to go with, if a little is good, more must be better. And I think in this case, there are some diminishing returns. It's just like there's diminishing returns in stride length in terms of really reaching out.
I was thinking two things when you're talking about this. One is that and I'm going to be a little ignorant here too, because I can't remember if they made the rules consistent, but at the time that they adopted that rule, some of the organizations where it was more youth-based, USSSA, where you saw a lot of those younger athletes, some of the high school leagues were allowing an actual step back onto that back foot. And so I think too, it created this idea, one, that made no sense, that we made two separate rules in different youth organizations, but it created this idea, I think, of like, then when you could do that, when you could do the step back, it was like people wanted to like, create this like rocky momentum, like I'm creating all this energy into it. And then you saw that start to translate for those, a lot of those same kids, I think, into, okay, I can't step anymore. But they, we started teaching the same idea of like, you're going to push from, that back leg, almost this like momentum concept. So I think I was thinking as we were talking, when you are giving these debriefs or seeing this pattern, do you get the sense that it was intended to, to be that far back, that this was like something they thought was going to generate momentum or power, or sort of like, is it sometimes we see in hitting this sort of like wide, almost too much push from the back leg. I like sink into the back leg. And I think a lot of times in hitting, I see it as it does start as this like momentum. I'm going to have this big move. I'm going to do all these things. I'm going to like push from the back leg, but then it goes astray because they can't kind of what you're saying, I guess, it's not necessarily up and hitting, but they can't control all that force they've created. And it's not necessarily force that we want to create, like, down in that way, and hitting is not really the type of, we want down ground force, but just trying to like sink or push down into it really fast in that way is usually, it ends up kind of exploding as they try to go into it. So what do you see it as an intense thing that people are going so wide, or why do you think, besides probably just not knowing where they should be stepping, and we gave them the freedom to do it, it's like coming from, or that idea is coming from?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think there probably are a handful of cases where it is intentional, where, the pitching instructor has said, okay, well, let's take advantage of this, basically. If we now can have this freedom of the leg, then let's take advantage of this without, and again, and not to their fault. I think, like, of course that makes sense. If you've been so restricted in your base of support as a pitcher, whether you were a pitcher yourself or you just see that's challenging to have your feet so close together, to then have to create, energy essentially from the drive foot.
Right. Now when you think about that, that's insane.
It's wild. But then I also think, I go back every once in a while and I'll look at, old video before the change, and trunk arm timing was significantly better. We have gotten to this crisis of poor trunk arm timing. And when I say crisis, I mean it, because 99% of the time, and I probably would say 99.9% of the time, when we say trunk arm timing is late, the arm is gone. The arm is ready. Like when we reach this point of, we call it arm 270, you could call it 9 o'clock, whatever you want to talk about in terms of the clock. But once the arm reaches this point where it is parallel with the ground, gravity is going to take over whether you like it or not, which means ball delivery is going to start whether you like it or not. So when we say like trunk arm timing is late, what we mean is the trunk was behind. It was late. It didn't do enough. It didn't support the arm. And then basically what happens on the other side of that, and I'll get back to whether that's intentional in a second, is pitchers that absorb their ground force on the stride leg, but like the arm's way the hell down here. The body is accepting that force, but the arm's like, I'm already ready to deliver the ball. So like, do what you want with that extra energy, but like, I can't utilize it. I'm already ready to deliver the ball. Gravity's already starting that. So whether that came from an intentional, coach instruction, whether that came from pitchers just being more comfortable because this base of support was so narrow, they just became more comfortable with shifting that leg back. I can see why. Again, it's creating a little bit more stability. I also think it's a little bit of a misunderstanding of this idea of what like use your legs actually means. Like if I could take that phrase and just like scratch it out and rewrite it, what I would say is use your drive leg. Because when we create rotation from our throwing side, we don't let the stride leg and our glove arm, to be honest, they're just indicators of how well we created rotation or how well we didn't create rotation. And the stride leg is going to be able to make up for some of the rotation we don't create, but you've got to be able to control it. So, I think there's definitely a component of they're being instructed to do that. But I also think that for a long time, we've taught pitching, again, not to a total fault, we've taught it as this like sprint start concept, where like if you've got a sprinter in the blocks and we're pushing off left to right, it's very similar to how we walk and how we create, propulsion forward. I don't deny that that's a good idea. If we are trying to put velocity on the ball towards the catcher, we got to create momentum towards the catcher, 100%. The trick though is we have to get our arm overhead. So like that's only going to play.
Right.
That's only going to play if
when you have to turn.
You got to turn.
You have to turn.
100%.
Right. Yeah, I think it's
100%.
this concept. I think as you were saying, I'm like, it's just this idea, and I think a very similar mistake happens sometimes in hitting. It's like, you know, we see these drills where it's just about out and pushing and energy, and you know,
Right.
let's get out as far as we can. Let's get up as far. I mean, there's a lot of different iterations. It's like go bigger, and what it ignores and what we know is important in the sort of like biomechanics of things is that there is, yes, probably there's a study out there and you might know, but that like the further the stride length, the more velocity you get. But the problem with just trying to make someone go out more is that they have to be able to do that and still hit the timing windows that are required and the speed that is required for you to rotate and to go in that sort of order. And so for most people, if you're like, hey, you know, 15-year-old person, that, you know, has medium force output outside of the pitching motion, let's just try to go out as far as possible. That's going to happen so slow. You know, they're never going to get the timing of that. And so there's just like blanket idea that works for everyone, and that's sort of what we do, I think, is just a misunderstanding of that sort of like when we say, you know, the speed, as we are starting to put out more information about the thing, if we say the speed at which you get off the rubber matters to velocity or something like that, that doesn't mean that the way you teach things like that is to then be like, now we have to go faster because that's what makes velocity.
Right,
it's like you have to understand then what goes into a stride length being further, what goes into someone being able to put force into the ground. And it's not just like push down as hard as you can, use your legs. Like I think that's the thing that happens. That certainly happens in hitting. We see something very similar where someone's like, use your legs. So we'll see in the force weight data for hitting that, you know, they start for a moment with a lot of force into the ground, and then the whole rest of the swing is just coming out of that because they can't maintain that. That's not the way it works. And so force into the ground comes from, yes, in pitching, we can sort of like control some of that at the beginning, but a lot of it then, especially like that front leg, comes from efficient rotation. Like it comes from this efficiency. And so I'm curious, and maybe we don't have enough of a sample size to see this yet, but for those kids where they have, you know, a lot of force in that back leg, what does it look like at landing leg, you know, as that leg then lands and their ability to put force into the ground? Is that low? Is that like, how are they able to, does that concept, you know, I imagine the reason we're putting so much force into that back leg is we think basically that carries over through the full pitching motion.
Yeah, that's a great question.
But have you seen that it does, or it diminishes, or we're not sure yet?
I would say we do know that. I think it's a basic, you know, it's Newton's first law. It's like whatever you create. So if you create a ton of energy on that stride leg, whether it's more vertically oriented or anterior towards the catcher, you put that leg in the air, right? And so whatever you've created, you've got to conserve. That's what that first law says. And then you've got to be able to basically effectively absorb it. So what I often see the pattern is like if that stride leg is just way too talkative, it's doing way too much, its magnitude is too much. We're not even able right now, I think, just from a like comfort level from our side to make inferences yet about impulse and the way the two things kind of work from a rotation standpoint, but just by magnitude, when that stride leg is doing way too much and it is just putting that energy in the ground, it then has to get absorbed when stride foot load hits. And so what I always end up pausing and saying is like, okay, when I put the skeleton, when I put the toe down and that vector first shows up on the force plate, I always take the time to explain. I was like, that's not stride foot load. That's stride foot contact. And so if we paused you with that video, you know, we took just regular video with a phone, you're going to look fantastic. Your foot is on the ground and your arm looks like it's in great trunk arm timing. But the beauty of the force plate is that we then go to what we have really, I think, determined to call stride foot load, which I always argue is like your arch has to be on the ground, right? If we're looking at video, it means it's not just heel toe, it's your foot is on the ground. When we see that with a force plate, I mean, those magnitudes skyrocket because it was created way back, you know, here in the load. The problem is not that the magnitude itself is like so high. It's that one, the stride leg often lands in a position that like it's not healthy for it, whether it's, you know, typically too closed off or there's using a ton of knee extension to decelerate. The challenge is like that that peak ground reaction force hits, and it's going to be high. It's several times of the pitcher's body weight. She can't leverage it. She can't use it. The arm is all the way the hell down here. And it's like, that's great. You've put all this energy in the system. You created it way back here and you put that energy in your system. But because of this challenge in the 2 turns, you can't do anything with it. And so it gets left then basically, to kind of get absorbed by the trunk, because the arm's like, forget it. I'm already gone. I'm ready to deliver the ball.
Right.
And then we end up with these deceleration patterns that are dangerous, that I will say, you know me, I don't use that term very lightly. They are dangerous, especially if we are landing in a position where we're very closed off. We're really pointed more towards right-handed, more towards third base dugout than we are landing towards the catcher or in the middle somewhere. That puts the hip in a tough position. We see this, if someone does land at that kind of halfway between home and the third base dugout, and they're using knee extension as a massive deceleration strategy because they have to. They have energy to dissipate.
Right.
That's where we see our ACLs being blown out, right? That from an acute injury standpoint, unfortunately, that pattern is creeping up a lot, where we're seeing pitchers that are, again, whether it's an intentional, front side resistance teach concept, you've got to go back to what was created all the way at the beginning, because you've got to leverage that and decelerate it at the end. And for that ground reaction force, it's like, it's just going back up in the body. It's not useful because trunk arm timing is often so poor that the arm is like, great, do what you want with that ground force, but like, I already got to deliver the ball. So that energy doesn't go anywhere. You're creating so much of it from, particularly in this instance, the stride foot. You're creating so much of it. You're just leaving your body to have to dissipate energy that you're leaving on the table. And so I use the phrase a lot of like velo on the table. Like, that's what I mean is like, you can have great, trunk arm timing, but if you can produce this amount of force, you can leverage it. But if your arm is all ready to go and deliver the ball and it's below the point of no return, where gravity's taking over, create all the energy you want, you can't use it. So it's like there is this trade-off of, we put a ton of energy in the ground. We keep saying energy, but it's force. We do it with power. We do it in short amounts of time. Great, do that in your load, but then your body has to be in a position to leverage it. And that's the disconnect. That's where I think we've traded off this, let's scoot the stride leg back, right? Let's let it have a little bit more of a roll, and misunderstanding then the consequence of when it does too much, because there's a balance when it does too much, and where basically that energy has to go. And for oftentimes it ends up being stuck in the knee, stuck in the hip, especially if those landing positions are poor, and it doesn't get out to the ball. So it's like, why are we creating it in the first place is where my brain goes, but again, I understand the like, we now have this extra room to play with, we should play with it. But we've got to know what the consequences are down the chain. And ultimately, the consequence of getting energy on the ball, because that's what matters at the end of the day.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting. I think obviously it's helped us understand timing of things for so long. A lot of the pitching data has just been on sort of like arms, and arms are kind of the determiner of timing, but understanding what the arms are doing to try to keep up with the timing, that's kind of what happens is like, if I'm creating and it's taking a long time and I'm working through that, my arms do a lot of things to kind of like get into the movement that they have to go. It's where we see arm path issues. It's where we see direction issues. Like, there's so many things that come from this, because at the end of the day, as we said, like you have to accomplish certain things in this timing to be able to do it. And when you've thrown off that timing because you've created too much force or you've put your body in a bad position, there's so many compensations that have. So I think it's really exciting to start to dive into that and to be at a place where we can use some of that in our conversations with athletes. And then, of course, the most exciting part, and we're starting to get there, I think, as we continue to gather this information, is to be able to aggregate some of this data and really start to see, like, what is our goal here when we are making, I think that's the type of thing we always say is like, when you're making a move in something like, let's be wider, let's be narrower, let's start here, like, let's start with our feet, closer together in the middle, or it's, you want to know why you're doing that. And so I think this force plate and what the implications of that are. Right now, we've just been all kind of guessing.
Right. And
I think that there's this force plate data is going to allow us, as we continue to develop it, to make some better educated suggestions and thoughts. This is kind of what we said, is it's data collection first. You start to see the patterns. Then you get into this window, which we have been in as we've started to see more and more of this data of like, okay, we can start to see what's happening because of this. So we can see when a kid is doing that. we can take some really good educated guesses on the training path to get, the timing better and to get things. And then we can retest it and we can just keep seeing that pattern. And we're kind of in that phase right now, I think, with the force plate data and with stride and start. And so it's just, fun and exciting to see if we can use that information to leverage, getting from A to B faster for athletes. It's just always our goal is, helping them get better from that standpoint.
I hope in future iterations of rule changes that, again, this isn't a blame. I just go back to, we have the ability now to explore what a change of constraint to a rule change does, right? I think of how, slappers and stepping on the line and how those things change and shape what a pitcher does, what a hitter does. I think the safety base is going to have an interesting...
big one is jumping.
Right, being able to...
So we're going to have a whole thing.
Right, the back foot coming off the ground, playing in the shift. Like all these things change the constraint for what that athlete has to do. And so I hope as we, as future iterations of rule changes happen, that this is a consideration, especially when it comes to something like the pitching motion, because, you can advocate for a change, but ultimately you've got to know then what the consequence is going to be down the line.
Right. Well, it's what we've said about slapping. It's was the intention that we got rid of slapping, because asking a slapper to be in a crossover and not step on the line,
it's wild.
Like we've said this, I'm like, I'm fairly certain that's not possible.
It's wild.
And definitely not on an outside pitch. So I just think now they're sort of changing. I think they're getting the ability to kind of go back. I think they proposed that. I'm not sure if it passed, but to go back to kind of not fully out of the box, but a little bit on the line or whatever. So that might change our game again, that we can, but I think those are the conversations of that. I mean, the lead off conversation that sort of was like an epic, interesting decision. But I think this for things like that, it's like what is let's say that the thing for slapping was we were allowing slappers to cover so much because they could step so far on the line, they could do these things, and we didn't feel like that was what we wanted slappers to be able to do. But you have to look at the flip side. What does this change about the skill? Is it even possible to do that? And I think sometimes we miss that window. And I think in this world where we could go test it before we do it, I think just being thoughtful of, sometimes you don't need to do that. Like the safety bag, I don't think we need to go test. We all know why we're doing that. But I think for some of it, when we're really, as you said, changing the constraint of some key skills in our game, I think being thoughtful around what that is going to mean for athletes, especially when we adopt it then across the youth level too, and kind of what that means. I think that's really important. So I'm excited. More to come on this. We're going to keep this short and sweet as a little intro.
We don't want to get too far away from having Ashley in the conversation. So a little teaser of this concept. I don't want her to have FOMO.
We'll be back. Yeah, we'll be back to talk about more, and we'll see you next week.
We appreciate you guys for listening to the podcast and making it possible that we can record this every week. So much so that we have a code, OGX Pod, that you can use on our shop to get 10% off all of our products. So just pop over to our website, click on shop, and then any of those products, put in OGX Pod and get 10% off today.